Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Today we are moving on to Journal Collection number 62, dating from the year 1871, and Emerson will be turning the ripe old age of 68 this year. And with that said, let's go ahead and get started with our biographical editorial update. Mr. Emerson seems to have lectured in some Massachusetts towns, also at Buffalo, Cleveland, and New Brunswick, New Jersey, during January. On February 3rd, he spoke by request at a meeting held for the purpose of organizing the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. In a letter of thanks, Mr. Martin Brimmer expressed his belief that the good effects of his speech in awakening substantial interest in the museum soon appeared. But through the winter Mr. Emerson had the serious task of preparing for a course of lectures on philosophy for a new class at the university. According to Mr. Cabot, the lectures were mainly the same as those given in the previous spring, except that identity and the Platonist were omitted, but wit and humor, demonology, and another on the conduct of the intellect were added. A large part of the new matter in this course was later used in Poetry and Imagination, and Letters and Social Aims, the next published volume. End note. January 1871. Old Age. Man is oldest when he is born, and is younger and younger continually. Taliesin, from Skene. February 10th. I do not know that I should feel threatened or insulted if a chemist should take his protoplasm or mix his hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon and make an animalcule incontestably swimming and jumping before my eyes. I should only feel that it indicated that the day had arrived when the human race might be trusted with a new degree of power, and its immense responsibility. For these steps are not solitary or local, but only hint of an advanced frontier supported by an advancing race behind it. What first scares the spiritualist in the experiments of natural science, as if thought were only finer chyle, fine to aroma, now redounds to the credit of matter, which it appears is impregnated with thought in heaven, and is really of God, and not of the devil, as he had too hastily believed. All is resolved into unity again. My chemistry, he will say, was blind and barbarous, but my intuition was, and will be true. I believe that every man belongs to his time, if our Newtons and philosophers belong also to the next age, which they helped to form. Our progress appears great only because the future of science is hidden from us. Philip Randolph. Of gravitation, John Mill said to Carlyle, "A force can act but where it is." "With all my heart," replied Carlyle, "but where is it?" March 5th. Dr. E.B. Pusey of Oxford surprised me 2 or 3 days ago with sending me, with greetings, a book, Lectures on Daniel and the Prophets, with the following inscription written on the blank leaf: "To the unwise and wise a debtor I. 'Tis strange if true, and yet the old is often new." When in England I did not meet him, but I remember that in Oxford Froude one day walking with me pointed to his window and said, "There is where all our light came from." I ought also to have recorded that Max Muller on last Christmas Day surprised me with the gift of a book. Coleridge says, "The Greeks, except perhaps in Homer, seem to have had no way of making their women interesting, but by unsexing them, as in the instances of the tragic Medea, Electra, etc. Contrast such characters with Spenser's Una, who exhibits no prominent feature, has no particularization, but produces the same feeling that a statue does, when contemplated at a distance. From her fair head her fillet she undied, and laid her stole aside. Her angel's face, as the great eye of heaven, shined bright, and made a sunshine in a shady place. Did never mortal eye behold such heavenly grace?" Greatness. Chateaubriand says that President Washington granted him an audience in Philadelphia, and adds, "Happy am I that the look of Washington fell on me. I felt myself warmed by them for the rest of my life." Calvert gives the anecdote. None is so great but finds one who apprehends him, and no historical person begins to content us. And this is our pledge of a higher height than he has reached. And when we have arrived at the question, the answer is already near. April 7th. Editor's Note. Mr. Emerson's good friend, Mr. John M. Forbes, hearing that he seemed worn and jaded by the strain of his philosophy lectures, 2 or more a week, invited him to be his guest on an excursion in a private car to California. In the party, besides Mr. and Mrs. Forbes and their youngest daughter, were Colonel Forbes with his wife, Mr. Emerson's daughter Edith, Mrs. George Russell, James B. Thayer, late Royal Professor of Law at Cambridge, Garth Wilkinson James, late the adjutant of Colonel Robert Shaw, and wounded on the slopes of Fort Wagner. Mr. Emerson's inborn reluctance to receive favors even from near friends, and his scruples about leaving his work, stood in the way, but at last he yielded to Mr. Forbes's tactful ingenuity of plea, and to his daughter's urgency, and went. The journey across the prairie mountains and desert, including a short stay at Salt Lake City and conversation with Brigham Young, the weeks in California in its spring freshness and sheets of flowers, were to Mr. Emerson an unforeseen delight and refreshment. The good friends in the party, with their tactful and affectionate care of him, each contributed to his pleasure, and his respect and admiration for the quality of his host grew with each day. Professor Thayer, in a little volume, gave a pleasant account of the journey. Mr. Emerson was enjoying the rest, and did little writing, but few notes of the trip occur. End note. California Notes. Irrigation. Tea, impossible culture where labor is dear as in America. Silk? Wine is not adulterated because grapes at 1 cent a pound are cheaper than any substitute. Cape Donner, Golden Gate, named of its flowers, Asia at your doors in South America, inflamed expectation haunting men, Henry Pierce's opinion of the need of check, calamity, punishment to teach economy, nickels for cents. Mission Dolores, Flora, the Altered Year, see Hittel on California, John Muir, General Sumner. Antelopes, prairie dogs, elkhorns, wolves, eagles, vultures, prairie hen, owls. Sequoias generally have marks of fire. Having lived 1,300 years, must have met that danger and every other in turn. Yet they possess great power of resistance to fire. See Cronus, pages 507 to 508. Sarcodes sanguinea, snow plant growing in the snow, a parasite from decayed wood. Monotropa caenothus, wild lilac. Madrona, Arbutus menziesi. Manzanita acrotophyllus glaucus. Black sand at Lake Tahoe and Carnelians, Mono Lake, glaciers, Clarence King, volcanic mountains, cones, Inyo County. The attraction and superiority of California are in its days. It has better days, and more of them, than any other country. Mount Shasta, 14,440 feet high, in northeastern corner of the state. Mount Whitney, 15,000 feet, in Tulare County. In Yosemite, grandeur of these mountains perhaps unmatched in the globe, for here they strip themselves like athletes for exhibition, and stand perpendicular granite walls, showing their entire height and wearing a liberty cap of snow on their head. Sequoia gigantea, Pinus lambertiana, sugar pine, 10 feet diameter, 300 feet height, cones 18 inches. Pinus ponderosa, yellow pine, Pinus albicaulis. May 12th. At the request of Galen Clark, our host at Mariposa, and who is by state appointment the protector of the trees and who went with us to the Mammoth Groves, I selected a Sequoia gigantea near Galen's hospice, in the presence of our party, and named it Samoset, in memory of the first Indian ally of the Plymouth colony, and I gave Mr. Clark directions to procure a tin plate and have the inscription painted thereon in the usual form of the named trees, and paid him its cost. Samoset, 12th of May, 1871. The tree was a strong, healthy one, girth at 2.5 feet from the ground, 50 feet. What they once told me at St. Louis is truer in California, that there is no difference between a boy and a man as soon as a boy is, quote, that high, high as the table. He contradicts his father. When introduced to the stranger, he says, "I am happy to make your acquaintance," and shakes hands like a senior. California is teaching in its history and its poetry the good of evil, and confirming my thought one day in 5 Points in New York, 20 years ago, that the ruffians and Amazons in that district were only superficially such, but carried underneath this bronze about the same morals as their civil and well-dressed neighbors. Gifts. The pleasing humiliation of gifts. The saying is attributed to Sir Isaac Newton that, quote, "they who give nothing before their death never in fact give at all." We are sometimes startled by coincidences so friendly as to suggest a guardian angel, and sometimes, when they would be so fit and every way desirable, nothing but disincidences occur. 'Tis perhaps thus. The coincidence is probably the rule, and if we could retain our early innocence, we might trust our feet uncommanded to take the right path to our friend in the woods. Editor's note. Mr. Emerson reached home in the last week in May, much refreshed, and having had pleasure in the company of his good friends. Perhaps on the journey he wrote at her request the following, Inscription for Mrs. Sarah Swain Forbes's memorial fountain. Fall, stream, to bless. Return to heaven as well. So did our sons. Heaven met them as they fell. What was the name of the nymph whom young Apollo courted for her hair? That fable renews itself every day in the street and in the drawing room. Nothing in nature is more ideal than the hair. Analyze it by taking a single hair, and it is characterless and worthless, but in the mass it is recipient of such variety of form, and momentary change from form to form, that it vies in expression with the eye and the countenance. The wind and the sun play with it and enhance it, and its coils and its mass are perpetual mystery and attraction to the young poet. But the doleful imposture of buying it at the shops is suicidal and disgusts. Nature lays the ground plan of each creature, accurately, sternly fit for all his functions, then veils it. My men. Thomas Carlyle, Louis Agassiz, E. Rockwood Hoare, J. Elliott Cabot, John M. Forbes, Charles K. Newcomb, Philip P. Randolph, Richard Hunt, Alva Crocker, William P. Ogden, Samuel G. Ward, J. R. Lowell, Sampson Reed, Henry David Thoreau, A. B. Alcott, Horatio Greenough, Oliver Wendell Holmes, John Muir. Editor's note. In June, Mr. Emerson had been chosen a member of the Massachusetts Historical Society, and on August 15th, when the Society celebrated the centennial anniversary of Scott's birth, Mr. Emerson spoke. What he said is printed in Miscellanies. End note. Scott said to Mr. Cheney, "Superstition is very picturesque, and I make it at times stand me in great stead, but I never allow it to interfere with the interest or conscience." Lockhart, Volume 8, page 81. I think he spoke honestly and well, but his superstition was dearer to him and more comprehensive than he well knew. I mean that it made him a sterner royalist, churchman, and conservative than his intellect should allow. Correlation of forces is an irrepressible hint which must compel the widest application of it. It gives unforeseen force to the old word of Cicero's, aliquid commune vinculum, and we realize the correlation of sciences. But poetry correlates men and genius and every fine talent, and men the most diverse. And men, when they are enemies, hug each other when they hear from that once hated neighbor the synonym of their own cherished belief. The splendors of this age outshine all other recorded ages. In my lifetime have been wrought 5 miracles, namely, the steamboat, the railroad, the electric telegraph, the application of the spectroscope to astronomy, the photograph. 5 miracles which have altered the relations of nations to each other. Add cheap postage and the mowing machine and the horse rake. A corresponding power has been given to manufacturers by machine for pegging shoes, and the power loom, and the power press of the printers. And in dentistry and in surgery, Dr. Jackson's discovery of anesthesia. It only needs to add the power which up to this hour eludes all human ingenuity, namely a rudder to the balloon to give us the dominion of the air, as well as the sea and the land. But the account is not complete until we add the discovery of Oersted, of the identity of electricity and magnetism, and the generalization of that conversion by its application to light, heat, and gravitation. The geologist has found the correspondence of the age of stratified remains to the ascending scale of structure in animal life. And now, the daily predictions of the weather for the next 24 hours for North America by the observatory at Washington. Poetry. The newness. Every day must be a new morn. Clothe the new object with a coat that fits it alone of all the things in the world. I can see in many poems that the coat is second hand. Emphasis betrays poverty of thought, as if the man did not know that all things are full of meaning, and not his trumpery things only. 'Tis the one of the mysteries of our condition that the poet seems sometimes to have a mere talent, a chamber in his brain into which an angel flies with divine messages. But the man, apart from this privilege, commonplace. Wordsworth is an example, and Channing's poetry is apart from the man. Those who know and meet him day by day cannot reconcile the verses with their man. Ah, not to me these heights belong, a better voice sings through my song. Editor's note. In July, at the commencement dinner at Harvard College, it being the 50th year since Mr. Emerson graduated, Mr. William Gray, who presided, called upon him to speak. He did so, but what he has said is not preserved. Rhetoric. All conversation and writing is rhetoric, and the great secret is to know thoroughly and not to be affected, and to have a steel spring. The English write better than we, but I fancy we read more out of their books than they do. For History of Liberty. There was a great deal of Whig poetry written in Charles and Cromwell's time. Not a line of it has survived. In certain minds, thought expels memory. I have this example, that, eager as I am to fix and record each experience, the interest of a new thought is sometimes such that I do not think of pen and paper at all, and the next day I puzzle myself in a vain attempt to recall the new perception that had so captivated me. Channing's poetry does not regard the reader. It is written to himself, is his strict experience, and the record of his moods, of his fancies, of his observations and studies, and will interest good readers as such. He does not flatter the reader by any attempt to meet his expectation, or to polish his record that he may gratify him as readers expect to be gratified. He confides entirely in his own bent or bias for meditation and writing. He will write as he has ever written, whether he has readers or not. But his poems have to me and to others an exceptional value for this reason. We have not been considered in their composition, but either defied or forgotten, and therefore read them securely as original pictures, which add something to our knowledge, and with a fair chance to be surprised and refreshed by novel experience. George Bradford said that Mr. Alcott once said to him, that as the child loses as he comes into the world his angelic memory, so the man, as he grows old, loses his memory of this world. October 18th. Bret Harte's visit. Bret Harte referred to my essay on civilization, that the piano comes so quickly into the shanty, etc., and said, "Do you know that on the contrary it is vice that brings them in? It is the gamblers who bring the music to California. It is the prostitute who brings the New York fashion of dress there, and so throughout." I told him that I spoke also from pilgrim experience, and knew on good grounds as the resistless culture that religion affects. October 21st. Ruskin is a surprise to me. This old book, Two Paths, is original, acute, thoroughly informed, and religious. As the fisher from the sea pulls the fish that no man saw. Name should be of good omen, of agreeable sound, commending the person in advance, and if possible, keeping the old belief of the Greeks, that the name borne by each man and woman has some connection with their part in the drama of life. The name then should look before and after. We have 2 or 3 facts of natural education. First, the common sense of merciless dealing of matter with us, punishing us instantly for any mistake about fire, water, iron, food, and poison. 2. In this world perfectly symmetrical, so that its laws can be reduced to one law. 3. Then we have the world of thought and its laws like Niagara currents. 4. Then the astonishing relation between these two. The necessity of the mind is poetic. It is plain that Kepler, Hunter, Bonnet, Buffon, Geoffroy St. Hilaire, Linnaeus, Huy, Oken, Goethe, and Faraday were poets in science as compared with Cuvier. The physicists in general repel me. I have no wish to read them, and thus do not know their names. But the anecdotes of these men of ideas wake curiosity and delight. Thus Goethe's and Oken's theory of the skull as a metamorphosed vertebra, and Hunter's arrested development, and Oersted's correlation of forces, and Hay's theory of the form of vases, and Garbet's and Ruskin's architectural theories, and Vitruvius's relation between the human form and the temple, and Peirce's showing that the orbits of comets, parabolics, make the forms of flowers, and Kepler's relation of planetary laws to music, and Franklin's kite. Reality, however, has a sliding floor. Look sharply after your thoughts. They come unlooked for, like a new bird seen on your trees, and if you turn to your usual task, disappear, and you shall never find that perception again. Never, I say, but perhaps years, ages, and I know not what events and worlds may lie between you and its return. In the novel, the hero meets with a person who astonishes him with a perfect knowledge of his history and character, and draws from him a promise that, whenever and wherever he shall next find him, the youth shall instantly follow and obey him. So is it with you and the new thought. For deathless powers to verse belong, and they like demigods are strong, on whom the muses smile. In Twistleton's Handwriting of Junius, page 14, I find the quotation from Johnson of Bacon's remark, "Testimony is like an arrow shot from a long bow. The force of it depends on the strength of the hand that draws it. Argument is like an arrow from a crossbow, which has equal force though shot by a child." Tibullus on Sulpicia says of Venus, and then there is a translation from the Latin that I will read. "Whatsoe'er she does, grace prompts unseen, and wheresoever she wanders, attends her footsteps." Then Twistleton's motto from Epicharmus is good. "The mind sees, the mind hears, all other things are deaf and blind." Geoffroy St. Hilaire is a true hero. Read his behavior in August 1792 when his masters Lamond and Huy, professors in his college of Cardinal Lemeon, and all the rest of the professors were arrested and sent to the prison of St. Firmin. Editor's note: here follows the account of his repeated attempts at desperate risk to himself and his final success in accomplishing the escape of 12 of his friends. End note. St. Hilaire was very ill in consequence of these exertions. Huy wrote to him, "Leave your problems of crystals, rhomboids, and dodecatries, stick to plants, which are full of beauty. A course of botany is pure hygiene." He went with Bonaparte to Egypt and saved the scientific results by a brilliant stroke of heroism. In the debate in the Académie des Sciences in 1830, July 19th, the contest between Cuvier and Geoffrey St. Hilaire broke out, and reminded the old sects of philosophers who shook the world with their contests. The austere and regulated thinkers, men of severe science, took part with Cuvier. The bold minds ranged themselves with Geoffrey. What changes have come into the contest of churches? The debates of the Ecumenical Council are only interesting to the Catholics and a few abnormal readers, interested as the billiard players in the contests of the billiard champions. Culture. The wide diffusion of taste for poetry is a new fact. We receive 12 newspapers in this house every week, and 11 of them contain a new poem or poems. All of these respectable, perhaps one or two fit to clip for the paper and put into your anthology. Many of these poems are quite as good as many of the pieces in Aiken's or Anderson's standard collections, and recall Walter Scott's reply when Tom Moore said, "Now, Scott, it seems to me that these young fellows write better poetry than we did, and nobody reads it. See how good this poetry is of so many young writers, and the public takes no note of them." Scott replied, "Egad, man, we are in the luck of time." Verses of conversation are now written in 100 houses, or for picnics or private theatricals, which would have made reputation a century ago, but are now unknown out of some family circle. Webster wrote excellent lines in an album. Macaulay did the same, his God. Then Birch's Riddle on the letter H. George Bartlett's wit and luck in the privatest game parties are charming, yet the public never heard of his name. Arthur Gilman, too. In England and France appears the Ferrers, Tom Taylors, Luttrells, Hendersons, Newton's Coates, too, of whom, but for Newton's one remark, we should have never heard. Yet good poetry is as rare as ever. What a benediction of heaven is this cheerfulness which I observe with delight, which no wrath and no fretting and no disaster can disturb, but keeps its perfect key and heals insanity in all companies and crises. Quote, "Little boys should be seen and not heard." Very well, but poets are not to be seen. Look at the foolish portraits of Herrick and Gray, one a butcher and the other silly. The Greek form answered to the Greek character, but poets are divided from their forms, live in official life. Intellect is impersonal. The father cannot control the child from defect of sympathy. The man with the longer scale of sympathy, the man who feels the boy's sense and piety and imagination, and also his rough play and impatience and revolt, who knows the whole gamut in himself, knows also a way out of the one into the other, and can play on the boy as on a harp, and easily lead him up from the scamp to the angel. America. Oxford, working steadily now for 1,000 years, or the Sorbonne in France, and a royal court steadily drawing for centuries men and women of talent and grace throughout the kingdom to the capital city, might give an impulse and sequence to learning and genius, and the history of this country has been far less friendly to a rich and polished literature than England and France. Count our literary men, and they are few, and their works not commanding. But if the question be not of books, but of men, question of intellect, not of literature, there would be no steep inferiority. For everyone knows men of wit and special or general power, whom to compare with the citizens of any nation. Edward Taylor lavished more wit and imagination on his motley congregation of sailors and caulkers than you might find in all France. The coarsest experiences he melted and purified, like Shakespeare, into eloquence. Wendell Phillips is a Pericles whilst you hear him speaking. Beecher, I am sure, is a master in addressing an assembly, though I have never heard such good speeches of his as I have read. Webster was majestic in his best days, and the better audience these men had, the higher would be the appreciation. Neither of them could write as well as he spoke. Appleton's wit is quite as good as Frere's or Selby's or Luttrell's, who shine in the biographies. And England has no occasional poet to surpass Holmes. Dr. Channing, I must believe, had no equal as a preacher in the world of his time. Then we have men of affairs who would rule wherever there were men, masters in commerce and law and politics and society. Every civil country has such, but I doubt if any has more or better than we. Add that the Adamses have shown hereditary skill in public affairs, and Judge Hoare is as good a lawyer, a statesman, and an influence in public and private life as any city could hope to find. I pass over my own list of thinkers and friends, often referred to, and only add that I believe our soil yields as good women, too, as England or France, though we have not a book from them to compare with Allemagne. Yet Aunt Mary's journals shine with genius, and Margaret Fuller's conversation did. Editor's note: the burning of Chicago occurred in early October. Mr. Emerson had not meant to go on a far journey to lecture again, but could not resist the appeal to go there and speak, which he did, and incidentally lectured in other cities. End note. Home again from Chicago, Quincy, Springfield, and Dubuque, which I had not believed I should see again, yet found it easier to visit than before, and the kindest reception in each city. This is the end of Journal Collection number 62, dating from the year 1871, when the author was 68 years old. Thank you for listening.